A millionaire moves into an old house, seeking peace and solitude. However, restless nights and strange noises lead him to an unexpected discovery. Hidden in one of the rooms, he finds a scared boy and a helpless baby. But the real question is, how did they get there? And what does that mean for him? If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and we'll keep going. Arthur looked up at the imposing mansion before him, its austere lines standing out against the cloudy sky of an autumn afternoon. The cold wind rustled the dry leaves around his feet, as if nature itself were whispering a warning. But for Arthur, this old and majestic building represented more than just a new home. It was the promise of a new beginning, far from the painful memories that haunted him. With a heavy sigh, he adjusted the strap of his suitcase over his shoulder and walked towards the entrance. Each step resonated in the stillness of the place, echoing through the abandoned property. The dusty windows seemed like empty eyes, watching his arrival with silent curiosity. As he turned the key in the lock, Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. The creak of the door echoed through the entrance hall, revealing an interior as imposing as it was melancholic. Furniture covered in white sheets resembled ghosts frozen in time, silent witnesses to stories long forgotten. Arthur set his bags down on the floor and allowed his eyes to roam the room. Despite the obvious neglect, there was an undeniable beauty to the classical architecture, the intricate carvings on the moldings, and the crystal chandelier that hung from the high ceiling. It was a place that exuded history, mystery, and paradoxically a sense of home that he hadn't felt in a long time. As he explored the rooms, Arthur noticed signs of a hasty departure of the previous residents. Drawers half open, a few personal objects forgotten here and there, as if the house had been left in the middle of an unfinished story. This realization, instead of bothering him, brought a strange sense of comfort. After all, he too was there to leave his past behind, to write a new chapter in his life. The businessman climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing against the ancient woodwork. Upstairs, he chose one of the bedrooms as his retreat. It was a spacious room with a large window that offered a panoramic view of the neglected gardens. Arthur opened the dusty curtains, allowing natural light to flood the room for the first time in years. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he finally allowed his emotions to overtake him. Memories of Laura, his wife, and Clara, his daughter, flooded his mind. Laura's radiant smile, Clara's infectious laughter, moments of happiness that seemed like they had happened in another life. And then the accident, that fateful day that changed everything, taking away not only his family but also his will to live. Arthur closed his eyes, trying to push away the painful images. That was why he was here, in that isolated mansion. To escape the pitying glances, the whispers in business meetings, the suffocating loneliness of his old apartment full of memories. Here, in this unknown and mysterious place, he hoped to find peace, or at least the silence necessary to heal his wounds. Hours passed as Arthur organized his belongings, a mechanical task that helped keep his mind occupied. As night fell, he turned on a few lamps, creating islands of light in the darkness of the house. The contrast between the illuminated areas and the shadows caused by the dim light created an almost ethereal atmosphere, as if the mansion existed on a plane between the real and the imaginary. Physically and emotionally exhausted, Arthur prepared a simple meal in the spacious kitchen. The sound of his cutlery against the plate echoed almost surreally in the absolute silence of the house. It was a constant reminder of his loneliness, but also of his newfound freedom. After dinner, Arthur headed to the library. The tall shelves were lined with ancient books, their gilded titles gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He ran his fingers along the dusty spines, feeling an inexplicable connection to these forgotten volumes. He selected a book at random and settled into a worn leather chair. Hours passed as he lost himself in the yellowed pages, grateful for the distraction. The silence of the night was occasionally broken by the creak of ancient woodwork adjusting itself, or the distant howl of the wind in the gardens. Arthur felt strangely at peace, as if the manor had welcomed him into its solitary embrace. It was only when his eyes began to grow heavy with fatigue that Arthur decided to retire. Climbing the stairs towards his room, He couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed to move on the walls, dancing in the flickering light of his lantern. For a moment, he thought he heard a distant whisper, as if the house were sharing its secrets. Lying in his bed, Arthur stared up at the ornate ceiling, his thoughts wandering between the past he was trying to forget and the uncertain future that awaited him. The mansion creaked and whispered around him, sounds that might once have been frightening but now seemed almost comforting. As sleep enveloped him, Arthur could not have imagined that his desire for solitude and silence would be challenged in ways he could never have foreseen. The mansion, with its shadowy hallways and rooms filled with history, held secrets that would soon begin to reveal themselves, forever changing the course of his life. With one last look into the darkness of the room, Arthur closed his eyes, surrendering himself to sleep. The first day of his new life was over, but the real journey was just beginning. The mansion, silent and watchful, seemed to wait patiently for the dawn, when the mysteries hidden within its depths would begin to awaken. The first rays of sunlight were filtering through the cracks in the curtains when Arthur woke. For a brief moment, disorientation overcame him, until the reality of his new situation came crashing back down. He was in the mansion, his self-imposed refuge from the outside world. Standing, Arthur walked to the window and opened the curtains, allowing the morning light to flood the room. Outside, the neglected garden stretched as far as the eye could see, a wild mix of untrimmed vegetation and wildflowers. It was a sight both melancholy and beautiful, perfectly reflecting his state of mind. Determined to start his day, Arthur walked down the stairs towards the kitchen. The silence of the mansion was almost palpable, broken only by the echo of his own footsteps. Entering the spacious kitchen, he went to the refrigerator, opening it to get the ingredients for breakfast. It was then that he noticed something strange. The bottle of milk he was sure he had bought the day before was missing. Frowning, Arthur searched through the refrigerator, thinking that perhaps he had stored it somewhere else. But there was no sign of the bottle anywhere. Strange, he muttered to himself, closing the refrigerator door. Maybe he had been more tired than he had realized the night before and had forgotten to put the milk away. Shrugging, he made himself some coffee without milk and sat down at the kitchen table. As he sipped his coffee, Arthur mentally planned his day. There was a lot of work to be done to make the mansion habitable. Cleaning, repairs, maybe even some renovations. The idea of keeping himself busy with practical tasks appealed to him. It was a way to keep the dark thoughts at bay. After breakfast, Arthur decided to start upstairs. Armed with cleaning supplies and a duster, he entered the first room. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs decorated the corners like delicate lace curtains. Meticulously, he began to clean, allowing the repetitive task to absorb him completely. It was while he was cleaning the third room that something caught his attention, a noise, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway. Arthur stopped, straining his ears. For a moment, everything was silent. Then again, the sound, like light, almost stealthy footsteps. Heart pounding, Arthur stepped out into the hallway. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the walls. There was no answer. The hallway was empty, the shadows seeming thicker in the corners, not illuminated by daylight. Shaking his head, Arthur tried to convince himself that it was just the old house adjusting, or perhaps an animal had found a way in. As he resumed his work, Arthur could not completely shake the feeling of unease. Every now and then, he would stop what he was doing, certain he had heard something. A rustle, a creak, the distant sound of a door closing. But each time he investigated, he found nothing out of place. As the day wore on, Arthur found himself becoming increasingly distracted. The feeling of being watched kept haunting him, causing him to constantly glance over his shoulder. In a moment of frustration, he dropped the duster and headed downstairs, deciding he needed some fresh air. In the garden, Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on his face. The contrast between the oppressive stillness of the mansion and the vitality of the nature around him was striking. Walking among the unkempt plants, he tried to organize his thoughts. It was ridiculous, he thought, to let himself be affected this way. After all, wasn't this what he wanted? Solitude, silence, a place where he could hide from the world and his own painful memories? Maybe he was just unaccustomed to silence, his mind filling the void with imaginary noises. Determined Not to let his irrational fear overcome him, Arthur went back inside. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though the feeling of unease never completely left him. As night began to fall, he found himself reluctant to turn on the lights, as if afraid of what the shadows might reveal. Finally, exhausted, both physically and emotionally, Arthur headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Opening the refrigerator, he froze. There on the shelf by the door was the bottle of milk that had disappeared that morning. Arthur picked it up with shaking hands, turning it this way and that, as if hoping to find some magical explanation for its reappearance. At that moment, a loud crash from upstairs made him jump. The bottle slipped from his hands, shattering on the floor and spilling milk everywhere. Heart pounding, Arthur stared at the ceiling, as if he could see through. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice betraying a mixture of fear and anger. Again, only silence answered. Ignoring the mess on the floor, Arthur took the stairs 2 at a time. In the upstairs hallway, all the doors were closed, just as he had left them. Slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, he began opening each, Tadatur inspecting the rooms. Nothing. No sign of intruders, no objects out of place. Everything was exactly as he had left it after cleaning. Arthur leaned against the wall, running his hands over his face. Was he losing his mind? Was isolation already affecting his sanity after just one day? Returning to the kitchen, Arthur mechanically cleaned up the mess, his mind a whirlwind of confused thoughts. As he tossed the broken glass into the trash, an idea began to form. What if the house wasn't really empty? What if somehow someone else was living here, hidden in some unknown corner of the mansion? The idea was both terrifying and absurd. Arthur knew he should call the police, report his suspicions, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride, a reluctance to admit that he was scared. Or maybe it was something deeper, a morbid curiosity about what was really going on in that house. That night, as Arthur lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house, every shadow that moved on the wall, seemed to carry a sinister meaning. He found himself wondering what Laura would say if she were there. She would probably laugh at his fears, affectionately calling him a fool. The thought brought a sad smile to his lips. As he stared at the ceiling, Arthur made a decision. Tomorrow he would search the mansion from top to bottom. He would check every corner, every possible hiding place. If there was someone or something hiding in this house, he would find it. With that determined thought in mind, Arthur finally managed to fall asleep. But his sleep was restless, filled with confused dreams of endless corridors and doors opening onto emptiness. And somewhere deep within the mansion, something waited patiently to be discovered. Dawn found Arthur already awake, his eyes red from a bad night's sleep, staring at the ornate ceiling of his room. The shadows of the night had dissipated, but the restlessness that had consumed him remained, pulsing in his chest like a second heart. Determined to unravel the mysteries that seemed to surround the mansion, Arthur rose with nervous energy. After a hurried breakfast, he began his methodical investigation of the house, determined not to leave any corner unexplored. He started in the attic, a large, dusty space he hadn't visited since arriving. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and old wood. Stacks of boxes and furniture covered in sheets created a maze of indistinct shapes in the dim light. Arthur turned on his flashlight, the beam dancing through the shadows as he advanced cautiously. Each opened box revealed fragments of past lives, yellowed photo albums, old letters tied with faded ribbons, forgotten toys that had once been treasured by some child. Arthur examined everything carefully, searching for some clue that might explain the strange events, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye. Hidden behind a pile of dusty paintings was an ancient-looking trunk. Unlike the other objects in the attic, this one looked like it had been placed there more recently. With his heart racing, Arthur walked over and tried to open it, only to find that it was locked. Frustrated but intrigued, he decided to leave the trunk for later. Descending from the attic, Arthur continued his search through the rest of the house. Every room was meticulously examined. Cupboards were opened, tapestries were pulled back from the walls, even the ceiling tiles were inspected for secret passages. Hours passed, and Arthur's frustration grew. He had found nothing that could explain the strange events. No sign of intruders, no hidden passages, nothing but the oppressive silence and the constant feeling of being watched. It was then that he remembered. The basement. It was the only place in the house he had not yet explored. With a mixture of apprehension and determination, Arthur headed for the door that led to the depths of the mansion. The stairs down to the basement creaked beneath his feet, each step seeming to protest his intrusion. The air grew colder and damper as he descended, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Arthur felt along the wall for a light switch. When the light finally came on, revealing the basement in its entirety, Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. The space was larger than he had imagined, with corridors branching off in different directions. Stacks of boxes and old furniture created a confusing maze, and shadows seemed to move in the corners not reached by the dim lighting. Arthur began to explore methodically, his heart beating faster and faster with each new corridor he entered. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and his rapid breathing. Then he heard it. A sound so low that at first he thought he imagined it, but there it was again. A faint shuffling, as if something, or someone, was moving stealthily in the shadows. "Who's there?" Arthur called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the basement. Gathering all his courage, Arthur advanced in the direction where he thought he had heard the sound. He turned. A corner, and nothing. Just more dusty boxes and furniture covered in sheets. Frustrated and increasingly nervous, Arthur was about to give up when he noticed something strange. One of the boxes seemed to have been moved recently, leaving marks in the dust on the floor. With his heart in his throat, he walked over and with trembling hands began to move the boxes aside. What he discovered behind them left him paralyzed with shock. There, huddled in a small space between the boxes and the wall, were two children. One boy, who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, was holding a baby protectively in his arms. Both were looking at Arthur with a mixture of fear and defiance in their eyes. For a moment, no one moved. Arthur, stunned, tried to process what he was seeing. The children, in turn, seemed ready to flee at the slightest movement. "It's okay," Arthur finally managed to say, his voice coming out hoarse and shaky. "I won't hurt you." The older boy, still hugging the baby tightly, looked at him suspiciously. His eyes, large and dark, seemed to contain a wisdom beyond his years, marked by experiences that no child should have to go through. How did you end up here?" Arthur asked softly, trying not to scare the children any further. The boy remained silent, but his eyes flickered to a pile of worn blankets and a few empty food containers hidden in the shadows. Arthur felt his heart sink as he realized that the children must have been living here for some time. Slowly, so as not to startle them, Arthur knelt down, level with the boy. "My name is Arthur," he said gently. "What is your name?" The silence persisted for several tense seconds before the boy finally spoke, his voice low and husky, as if it had not been used in a long time. "Michael," he whispered. Arthur felt a wave of relief at the sound of the boy's voice. It was a start. "What about the baby?" he asked, indicating the child in Michael's arms. "Lucas," Michael replied, his embrace tightening protectively around the baby. Arthur nodded, trying to keep his voice calm and comforting. "You must be hungry. How about we go upstairs and I fix you something to eat?" Michael hesitated, his eyes darting between Arthur and the stairs leading out of the basement. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he gave a small nod. With slow, careful movements, Arthur stood and stepped back, making room for Michael to stand with Lucas. The boy moved with cautious grace, his eyes never leaving Arthur as he rose, still, holding the baby tightly. As he led the children out of the basement, Arthur's mind was spinning with questions. Who were these children? How had they gotten here? And most importantly, what should he do now? One thing was certain: his life in the mansion had just become infinitely more complicated. What had started as a search for answers about strange events had turned into something much bigger. Arthur didn't know what the future held, but as he watched Michael carefully carry Lucas up the stairs, he felt a determination grow within him. These children needed help, and somehow he knew he was destined to provide it. The mystery of the mansion had only just begun to unfold, and Arthur had a feeling that the revelations that lay ahead would change his life forever. The mansion's kitchen, once a solitary space for Arthur, now seemed small and cozy, with the unexpected presence of Michael and Lucas. The businessman moved carefully, preparing a simple meal while watching the children out of the corner of his eye. Michael sat at the table, Lucas firmly on his lap. His eyes followed Arthur's every move, a mixture of suspicion and hunger evident in his gaze. The baby, for his part, remained surprisingly still, as if he sensed the tension in the air. "I hope you like scrambled eggs," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice light as he set the plates on the table. "We also have some bread and milk." Michael looked at the food, then at Arthur, as if expecting some kind of trick. Slowly, still holding Lucas with one arm, he picked up a piece of bread and sniffed it before taking a small bite. Arthur sat down on the other side of the table, giving the children space. He watched silently as Michael, apparently satisfied that the food was safe, began to eat more enthusiastically, alternating between feeding himself and feeding small pieces of egg to Lucas. "How long have you been here?" Arthur asked softly after a few minutes of silence. Michael stopped chewing, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, Arthur thought he wouldn't answer, but then the boy muttered, "Too long." Arthur nodded, deciding not to press. "What about your parents? Is anyone looking for you?" The mention of parents made Michael visibly flinch. He hugged Lucas tighter and shook his head. "No one's looking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur's heart sank at those words. What had these children gone through to end up alone in that abandoned mansion? He knew he needed to gain Michael's trust if he wanted to help them. But he was also aware that one wrong move could cause the boy to shut down completely. "Michael," Arthur said gently, "I know you don't know me and you have no reason to trust me. But I want you to know that you are safe here. No one is going to hurt you." The boy stared at him for a long moment before turning his attention to Lucas, who was beginning to grow restless. With a skill that surprised Arthur, Michael adjusted, the baby in his arms, murmuring soothing words that seemed to calm him instantly. Watching the interaction, Arthur couldn't help but admire the bond between the two children. It was clear that Michael, despite his own youth, had taken on the role of Lucas's protector. "Are you brothers?" Arthur asked, curious. Michael hesitated, before answering, "Not blood, but we are family." The answer, though vague, spoke volumes. Arthur nodded understandingly. "I see. Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we are born into." Something in Michael's face softened slightly at those words, as if Arthur had passed some kind of unstated test. The rest of the meal passed in a more comfortable silence. When the plates were empty, Arthur stood to clear them. "You must be tired," he said. "How about I show you to a room where you can get some proper rest?" Michael seemed to hesitate, looking toward the basement. Arthur, sensing his dilemma, quickly added, "Don't worry, you can go back to the basement later if you prefer, but I think a comfortable bed would do you both good." After a moment of consideration, Michael nodded. Arthur led them upstairs, choosing one of the guest rooms he had recently cleaned. The room was spacious, with a large double bed and heavy curtains that could completely block out the daylight. "Feel free to rest," Arthur said, opening the curtains to let in the afternoon sunlight. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." As he was about to leave the room, Michael's voice stopped him. "Why are you helping us?" Arthur turned, meeting the boy's questioning eyes. The question took him by surprise, but he knew his answer was crucial. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because maybe in some way, by helping you, I'm also helping myself." Michael studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. Arthur took this as his cue to leave, closing the door softly behind him. Back in the living room, Arthur slumped into an armchair, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What should he do now? The obvious decision would be to contact the authorities, but something was making him hesitate. The fear in Michael's eyes, the way he'd talked about no one looking for them. There was more to this story than met the eye. Arthur picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He could call the police right now, put an end to this surreal situation. But then he remembered the look in Michael's eyes when he mentioned his parents, the care the boy had treated Lucas. No, he couldn't just hand them over without fully understanding the situation. Putting the phone aside, Arthur decided he needed to gain Michael's trust first. Only then could he truly help them. But how to do that? How to break down the barriers the boy had clearly erected? As Arthur pondered these questions, he found himself thinking about Laura and Clara. What would his wife do in that situation? She had always had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel safe and understood. And Clara, with her endless curiosity and open heart, would probably have befriended Michael in a matter of minutes. The pain of loss, always present, but usually buried beneath layers of denial, came flooding back. Arthur felt tears forming in his eyes and quickly wiped them away. This wasn't the time for this. There were two children who needed him right now. Taking a deep breath, Arthur stood up. He needed to prepare himself. The children would probably need clean clothes, more food, maybe some toys for Lucas. And he needed to think of a way to get Michael to open up, to understand what had really happened to them. As he moved through the house, making a mental list of what needed to be done, Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. As unexpected and complicated as this situation was, it had pulled him out of the torpor he had been in since the loss of his family. The mansion, which until then had seemed like a refuge from his pain, now took on new life. The previously silent hallways echoed with the promise of children's voices. And Arthur, who had come here seeking isolation, found himself faced with the possibility of connection. As the afternoon wore on, Arthur found himself glancing up the stairs frequently, waiting for a sound to come from the room where Michael and Lucas were resting. The silence persisted, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a silence of expectation, of possibility. Arthur knew the next few days would be crucial. Gaining Michael's trust, discovering the truth about his situation, deciding the best course of action. All of this lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to face the challenge. Night was slowly falling over the mansion, enveloping it in soft shadows. Arthur turned on a few lamps, creating islands of welcoming light. And as he waited for his unexpected visitors to descend, he allowed himself a small smile. Life, he realized, had a curious way of surprising us when we least expected it. The following days brought an unexpected routine to the mansion. Arthur, accustomed to solitude, now found himself immersed in a world of cares and worries that he had not experienced for a long time. Michael and Lucas, for their part, seemed to slowly adapt to the new situation, although distrust still hung in the air like a thin mist. On the morning of the third day after the children's discovery, Arthur woke early, determined to make some progress. He crept downstairs quietly, hoping not to wake the boys, but to his surprise he found Michael already in the kitchen, feeding Lucas with a skill that bordered on motherly. "Good morning," Arthur said softly, not wanting to startle them. Michael simply nodded in response, his eyes following Arthur's every move as he moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" Arthur asked, trying to start a conversation. Michael shrugged. "Lucas slept, I stayed awake." The answer took Arthur by surprise. "All night? Why?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking to the windows before returning to Arthur. "To make sure we were safe." Arthur's heart sank at those words. What had these children been through to make Michael feel the need to stand guard at night? "Michael," Arthur began, choosing his words carefully, "you know you're safe here, right? No one's going to hurt you." The boy stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You say that now, but people change their minds." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine at the bitterness in Michael's voice. Clearly, the child had been deeply hurt by someone he trusted. "I understand that it's hard to trust," Arthur said gently, "but I promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you both. You don't have to carry all this weight alone, Michael." Something in the boy's eyes flickered, a mix of hope and fear that made Arthur's heart ache. But before Michael could respond, Lucas began to cry, demanding attention. Arthur watched as Michael cared for the baby with surprising tenderness for one so young. It was clear that the bond between the two children was deep and complex. "Michael," Arthur said after a moment, "I know this is hard to talk about, but I need to understand your situation better. Where did you come from? How did you end up in this house?" The boy tensed, his arms tightening protectively around Lucas. For a moment, Arthur thought he would clam up again, but then Michael began to speak, his voice low and hesitant. We ran away," he said. "The man and the woman. They weren't good. They screamed a lot, and sometimes—" Michael stopped, swallowing hard. "Sometimes they hurt." Arthur felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. Who would dare hurt these children? He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm so as not to scare Michael. "Were those your parents?" Arthur asked softly. Michael shook his head. "No. My mother. She's somewhere else. The man was my father, but he changed. The woman was his wife." Arthur nodded, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. "And Lucas?" "Her son," Michael replied, his eyes softening as he looked at the baby. "But she didn't take good care of him, so I did." The story unfolded before Arthur, revealing layers of neglect and abuse that made his stomach turn. But there was also heroism in the way Michael, still a child himself, had taken it upon himself to protect Lucas. "You were very brave," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you did the right thing by running away. But now you are not alone. I will help you." Michael looked at Arthur, a mixture of hope and skepticism in his eyes. How? It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Arthur knew that the answer he gave now could determine whether Michael would trust him or not. "First," Arthur began, "let's make sure you're safe and healthy. Then we'll try to find your mother, Michael. And as for Lucas, we'll make sure he ends up with people who truly care about him." "I can't leave Lucas," Michael said quickly, panic evident in his voice. "I promised I would always take care of him." Arthur was quick to reassure him. "No one will separate you, Michael, I promise. You two will be together, no matter what." The words seemed to calm the boy, who visibly relaxed. Arthur realized he had crossed an important barrier. Michael was beginning to trust him. The rest of the morning passed in a quiet routine. Arthur prepared a substantial meal, watching with satisfaction as Michael ate with appetite. Lucas, having been fed, played contentedly with some makeshift toys Arthur had found. As he watched the children, Arthur felt a mix of emotions. There was anger at what they had been through, determination to help them, and surprisingly, a growing sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. In the afternoon, while Lucas dozed and Michael absently leafed through an old book Arthur had given him, the businessman retired to his office. He knew he had to act, but he was also aware of the risks involved. Calling the authorities was the obvious course of action, but Arthur feared that doing so might result in the children being separated or worse, their return to the abusive situation they had fled. No, he needed a more careful plan. Sitting at his desk, Arthur began making calls. He called lawyer friends, social services contacts, even a private detective he had met years ago. He was determined to use every resource at his disposal to help Michael and Lucas. The hours passed quickly as Arthur made plans and considered options. When he finally emerged from his office, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He found Michael in the living room, Lucas asleep in his arms. The boy looked at Arthur with an expression that was a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Is everything okay?" Michael asked, his voice barely above. A whisper so as not to wake the baby. Arthur sat down beside him, smiling gently. "Yes, Michael. In fact, I think things will get even better soon." The boy studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're really going to help us, aren't you?" "I will," Arthur replied firmly. "You're not alone on this journey anymore." That night, as the mansion grew quiet, Arthur reflected on how his life had changed drastically in just a few days. What had started as an escape from reality had turned into a mission of rescue and redemption. Looking out the window at the stars that dotted the night sky, Arthur made a silent promise. He would protect these children, help heal their wounds, and in the process maybe he could heal a little bit of himself as well. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal and emotional obstacles, but for the first time in a long time Arthur felt truly alive, driven by a purpose greater than himself. With that comforting thought, he prepared for bed, knowing that the dawn would bring new challenges and hopefully the beginning of a healing journey for them all. The next morning brought a different energy to the mansion. Arthur woke up early, his mind already alert, planning his next steps. As he prepared breakfast, he heard light footsteps coming down the stairs. Michael appeared in the kitchen, carrying Lucas, who was babbling happily. "Good morning," Arthur smiled, placing a plate of pancakes on the table. "Did you sleep better last night?" Michael nodded shyly, sitting down at the table. "A little," he admitted. As they ate, Arthur watched the children, noticing how Michael seemed more relaxed, less tense than he had been in the previous days. It was progress, albeit a small one. "Michael," Arthur began, choosing his words carefully, "remember, we talked about finding your mother." The boy froze, his fork stopping in midair. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "Well, I have some friends who can help us with that. But to do that, we need to know more about her. Do you feel comfortable talking about it?" Michael was silent. For a moment, his eyes moving from Arthur to Lucas and back again. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Her name is Mari," he began, his voice low. "She has dark hair and brown eyes like mine. She always smelled like lavender." Arthur listened intently, making mental notes. "Do you remember where you lived before?" Michael frowned, concentrating. "It was a small town. It had a big park with a lake. Mom and I used to feed the ducks on Sundays." As Michael spoke, more details emerged. The name of a school, fragments of an address, memories of a life that seemed so distant now. Arthur absorbed each piece of information, knowing that each detail could be crucial. "You're doing very well, Michael," Arthur encouraged. "This information will help us a lot. Now, about your father and the woman he was with." Michael's face instantly fell. "I don't want to talk about them," he said firmly. Arthur nodded understandingly. "I understand, but any information can help us protect you and Lucas. We don't need to talk about what they did, just names or places if you can remember." After a long moment of hesitation, Michael spoke. "His name is Daniel. His wife, I think her name is Carol. They moved around a lot. We never stayed in one place for long." Arthur asked a few more gentle questions, getting as much information as Michael felt comfortable sharing. When he was done, he stood and placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were very brave, Michael. Thank you for trusting me." The rest of the morning passed in a quiet routine. Arthur made a few discreet calls, passing on the information he had gathered to his contacts. Meanwhile, Michael and Lucas joked around in the living room, their occasional laughter echoing through the mansion. It was early afternoon when something unexpected happened. Arthur was in his office when he heard a scream coming from the living room. Rushing in, he found Michael standing in front of the fireplace, holding a small object in his trembling hands. "What happened?" Arthur asked, worried. Michael turned slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. In his hands was an ancient medallion, its golden surface glowing softly in the sunlight. This was my mother's," Michael whispered in disbelief. Arthur stepped closer, examining the locket. It was a delicate piece with an intricate design on the front and a small photo inside, a young woman with baby Michael in her arms. "How did this get here?" Arthur muttered, more to himself than to Michael. The boy looked around the room as if seeing the place for the first time. Maybe my mother was here? The suggestion hung in the air, full of possibilities. Arthur felt his heart race. Could it be that the history of this house was more intertwined with Michael's than they had imagined? Moved by a sudden impulse, Arthur began to examine the room thoroughly. Michael, taking his cue, did the same, with Lucas watching curiously from his makeshift playpen. It was Michael who made the next discovery. Behind a bookshelf, he found a small, hidden box. When they opened it, they found a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents. Arthur picked up one of the letters, his eyes quickly scanning the handwritten lines. His face paled as he read. "Michael," he said slowly, "I think we've found something very important." The letters revealed a complex and disturbing story. They spoke of a network of illegal adoptions, of children being separated from their families, of money changing hands. and to Arthur's shock, the name of his own father, Edmund, appeared repeatedly. "What does it say?" Michael asked anxiously. Arthur hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's complicated," he finally said, "but I think it might help us find your mother." As Arthur continued to look through the documents, his mind was spinning. The implications of what he was discovering were enormous. Not just for Michael and Lucas, but for himself. His father, a man he had always seen as a model of integrity, seemed to be at the center of something very dark. The rest of the day passed in a blur of frantic activity. Arthur made more phone calls, sent urgent emails, all the while keeping an eye on the children. Michael, sensing the change in the air, was alternately anxious and hopeful. That night, with the children finally asleep, Arthur sat in his office, letters and documents spread out before him. The magnitude of what he had discovered hit him full force. Her father was not just a passive observer, but an active participant in this illegal adoption scheme. And even more shocking, there was evidence that Laura, his late wife, was investigating the case shortly before the accident that took her life. Arthur felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about his past, was being questioned. And now, he found himself at the center of a web of secrets and lies that stretched back decades. Looking at a photo of Laura on his desk, Arthur felt a mixture of pain and determination. She had died seeking truth and justice. Now it was his turn to continue that fight. With a deep sigh, Arthur picked up his phone. There was a call he needed to make, one that could change everything. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number of Mari, Michael's mother, whom his contacts had finally located. As the phone rang, Arthur looked down the dark hallway that led to the rooms where Michael and Lucas slept. He had promised to protect them, and now he realized that that promise went far beyond what he had initially imagined. The sound of a voice on the other end of the line brought him back to the present moment. "Hello?" a female voice replied hesitantly. Arthur took a deep breath. "Hello, my name is Arthur. I'm calling about your son, Michael." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Then Mari's voice, trembling and hopeful, filled the line. You found my son." And with those words, Arthur knew there was no turning back. The search for truth and justice had only just begun, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the personal cost. Dawn found Arthur still in his office, his eyes red from a sleepless night. His conversation with Mari had been intense and emotional, full of tears and promises. She was on her way, eager to reunite with the son she had thought she had lost forever. With heavy steps, Arthur headed to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. His thoughts were a whirlwind of worries and plans. How would he explain the situation to Michael? How would they deal with Mari's impending arrival? And, perhaps, most disturbing, how would they cope with the dark revelations about their own family's past? Lost in his thoughts, Arthur barely noticed when Michael walked into the kitchen, Lucas in his arms. "You didn't sleep," the boy stated more than asked, his keen eyes studying Arthur's tired face. Arthur forced a smile. "I had a lot on my mind," he replied, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of Michael. "Actually, there's something important we need to talk about." Michael visibly tensed, his arms squeezing Lucas protectively. Arthur was quick to reassure him. "It's a good thing, Michael, I promise." Taking a deep breath, Arthur began to explain. He talked about the call to Mari, about how she had never given up looking for Michael, about how she was on her way right now. Michael's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: hope, fear, joy, distrust. Is she really coming?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur nodded, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She is. She never stopped loving you or looking for you, Michael." Tears began to form in the boy's eyes. "But what about Lucas? I promised I would take care of him. I can't abandon him." "No one will separate you," Arthur assured firmly. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" Michael nodded slowly, hugging Lucas closer. The baby, oblivious to the tension of the moment, played happily with a spoon. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparations. Arthur tidied the guest room for Mari, while Michael, too nervous to sit still, followed him around the house, asking endless questions about his mother. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of a car approaching broke the tension of waiting. Michael froze, his face pale with anticipation. Arthur placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. I'll answer the door. Stay here with Lucas." With his heart racing, Arthur opened the front door. There, standing in the doorway, was Mary. Her eyes, identical to Michael's, were filled with tears. For a moment, no one moved. Where is my son?" Mary finally managed to say, her voice choked with emotion. Arthur stepped aside, revealing Michael, who was standing in the hallway, Lucas tightly in his arms. Time seemed to freeze. Mother and son stared at each other, years of separation and longing condensed into a single moment. "Mommy," Michael whispered, his voice shaking with uncertainty and hope. With a sob, Mary ran toward her son. Michael instinctively took a step back, years of distrust fighting against the desperate urge to throw himself into his mother's arms. Arthur watched, his heart heavy, as Mary stopped a few steps away from Michael, respecting his space. "My son," she said softly, tears streaming freely down her face. "My dear Michael, you have grown so much." Slowly, as if he feared she might disappear at any moment, Michael reached out a trembling hand toward his mother. Mary took it gently, and it was as if a dam had broken. With a sob, Michael threw himself into his mother's arms, still holding Lucas. Mary wrapped them both in a tight hug, years of pain and longing, dissolving into tears of relief and joy. Arthur stepped away discreetly, giving the newly reunited family a moment of privacy. His chest was tight with a mixture of emotions. Joy at the reunion, sadness at his own losses, and a renewed determination to uncover the full truth behind this story. Later, when the initial emotions had calmed down, everyone gathered in the living room. Mary kept her eyes on Michael, as if she feared he might disappear if she blinked. Michael, for his part, seemed to waver between happiness at being with his mother and concern for Lucas's future. "I can't leave him," Michael said firmly, holding the baby. "I promised I'd take care of him." Mary looked at Arthur, then back at her son. "Michael, honey, no one is going to separate you. Lucas is part of the family now." The tension in Michael's shoulders visibly relaxed at those words. Arthur felt a surge of admiration for Mary. Amid her own joy, she understood and respected the bond between children. As the evening progressed, the conversation became more serious. Arthur shared with Mary his discoveries about the illegal adoption ring, his father's possible involvement, and the connection to his late wife's investigation. Mary's face darkened. "I always knew there was something bigger behind Michael's disappearance," she said, "but I never imagined it was something this big." Arthur nodded gravely. "And I fear this goes far beyond what we have already discovered. Mary, we need to be cautious. The people behind this are powerful and will not hesitate to protect their secrets." "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his small voice reminding everyone that despite everything he had been through, he was still just a child. Arthur exchanged a look with Mary before answering. "We will fight for truth and justice, but most of all, we will keep you safe." That night, long after Michael and Lucas had been put to bed, Arthur and Mary lay awake, discussing their next steps. There was much to be done. Secure Michael and Lucas's legal safety, investigate further into the illegal adoption ring, and prepare for what would surely be an uphill battle ahead. As they talked, Arthur couldn't help but notice the strength and determination in Mary's eyes. Here was a woman who had faced the worst life had to offer and still hadn't given up. Her courage was inspiring. When they finally retired for the night, the sun was already threatening to rise over the horizon. Arthur stopped for a moment in the hallway, looking at the door to the room where Michael and Lucas slept. The mansion, which just a few days ago had seemed so empty and lifeless, was now full of hope and possibilities. Lying in bed, exhausted but with his mind still racing, Arthur reflected on how his life had changed drastically in such a short time. What had started as an escape from reality had turned into a mission of rescue and redemption. And as sleep finally enveloped him, Arthur made a silent promise. He would see this journey through to the end, no matter the cost. For the memory of Laura, for the safety of Michael and Lucas, and for the chance to finally make peace with his own past. He would face whatever came his way. Dawn would bring new challenges, but also new hopes. And together, this unlikely family would find the strength to face whatever the future held. The days that followed Mari's arrival brought a new dynamic to the mansion. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the hallways, mixed with the low-voiced conversations between the adults. Arthur watched with a mixture of joy and apprehension as Michael slowly lowered his defenses, allowing himself to enjoy his mother's presence. One sunny morning, while Mari and the children enjoyed the garden, Arthur found himself back in his office, immersed in the documents they had discovered. Each new piece of information seemed to open up more questions than answers, forming a complex web of secrets and lies. It was at that moment that his phone rang. The name on the screen made his heart race. It was his contact at the police, Detective Rodrigo Silva. "Arthur," Rodrigo's deep voice sounded on the other end of the line. "We have news and it's not good." Arthur felt a knot form in his stomach. "What did you find out?" "Daniel and Carol, the ones who kept Michael, have been located," Rodrigo explained. "But the situation is complicated. They have powerful connections, Arthur. We're talking about influential people, politicians, even judges." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the revelation. "They know about Michael." There was a tense pause before Rodrigo answered. "We believe so. And there's more. We've found evidence that suggests the accident that killed your wife may not have been an accident." The world seemed to spin around Arthur. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to process the information. Laura, his Laura, would have been... He couldn't even complete the thought. "Arthur, are you still there?" Rodrigo's voice brought him back to reality. "Yes," he replied, his voice hoarse. "What do we do now?" "For now, stay where you are. The mansion is secure and off the grid. We're building a case, but we need more time. And Arthur, be careful. These people won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect their secrets." After hanging up, Arthur stood still for long minutes, his mind in turmoil. The truth he sought seemed increasingly dark, more dangerous, and now it wasn't just about Michael and Lucas, but also about Laura, about justice for her memory. A sound from the garden pulled him out of his thoughts. Looking out the window, he saw Mari pushing Michael on a makeshift swing, her laughter reaching him. Lucas, sitting on a blanket in the grass, clapped his hands happily. The scene brought a sad smile to Arthur's lips. These people had become his family, and he would do anything to protect them. With renewed determination, Arthur returned to the documents. There was something there, he was sure, some clue that might unravel the whole scheme. Hours passed as he pored over every detail, every name, every date. It was as the sun was setting that Arthur found something, a series of carefully hidden bank transactions linking his father to a shell company. And the name of the company's owner made his blood run cold. He was a well-known federal judge, someone with enough power to cover up an operation of this magnitude. "Arthur!" Mari's voice surprised him. She was standing in the doorway of the office, a worried expression on her face. "Are you okay? You've been here all day." He hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but looking into Mari's eyes, Arthur realized that she deserved to know the truth. "Sit down, Mari," he said softly. "We have much to talk about." In the hours that followed, Arthur shared everything he had discovered. Daniel and Carol's connections, the suspicions surrounding Laura's death, the possible involvement of powerful figures. Mari listened in silence, her face a mask of shock and determination. "What shall we do?" she asked when Arthur finished. "We will fight," he replied without hesitation, "for the safety of Michael and Lucas, for Laura's memory, for the truth. But it will not be easy, and it will certainly be dangerous." Mari nodded, a spark of fire in her eyes. "I've spent years fighting to find my son. I won't stop now." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Michael appeared in the doorway, his eyes sleepy. "Is everything okay?" he asked, sensing the tension in the air. Arthur and Mari exchanged a look before Mari stood up to hug her son. "It's okay, honey. We were just talking about how to keep you safe." Michael looked from one adult to the other, his expression serious beyond his years. It's about the bad man, isn't it? He's coming after us? Arthur's heart sank at the question. How could he explain to a child that the world was sometimes much more complicated and frightening than it should be? Michael, Arthur began, choosing his words carefully. There are bad people who might want to hurt you, but I promise, your mother and I will do everything we can to protect you and Lucas. The boy nodded slowly, his small hand squeezing Marie's. I know you will. You're the good adults. At that moment, seeing the trust in Michael's eyes, Arthur felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. He could not fail these children, could not let the evil they had faced reach them again. In the days that followed, the mansion became a fortress of secrets and plans. Arthur reinforced security, installing cameras and alarm systems. Marie, using her contacts as a journalist, began to discreetly investigate those involved in the scheme. Meanwhile, life went on. Michael and Lucas played in the garden, oblivious to the danger that loomed over them. Arthur watched them from his window, determined to preserve their innocence for as long as possible. One night, while everyone was asleep, Arthur found himself back in his office, rereading Laura's letters. In the midst of her investigations into the illegal adoptions, she had left clues, connections that only now made sense. "Oh, Laura," he murmured into the silence of the night, "you were so close to figuring it all out. I will finish what you started, my love. I promise." A sudden noise made him jump up, alert. It was coming from the entrance of the mansion. With his heart racing, Arthur picked up the phone, ready to call the police. But before he could dial, he heard a familiar voice. "Arthur. Arthur." He froze. He knew that voice. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to his past, to a time before all this madness began. With hesitant steps, Arthur made his way to the front door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a face he had thought he would never see again. "Edmund," he whispered in disbelief. His older brother, reported missing for over a decade, stood there in the doorway. His eyes, so much like Arthur's, were filled with urgency and fear. "Arthur," Edmund said, his voice shaking, "we need to talk. We're all in danger." And just when Arthur thought things couldn't get any more complicated, the universe proved him wrong. The web of secrets and lies had just gained another thread, and the revelations that followed would change the course of their lives forever. Arthur stared at his brother, Edmund, with a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sound of crickets. "Come in," Arthur finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. Edmund stepped across the threshold, his eyes roving the interior of the mansion with a familiarity that surprised Arthur. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of nostalgia and guilt, that made Arthur wonder how much his brother really tried you. "We need to talk in private," Edmund muttered, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder. Arthur nodded, leading him to his office. Once inside, with the door closed, Edmund collapsed into a chair, seeming to age 10 years in seconds. "You have no idea how much I wanted to get away from all this," Edmund began, his voice thick with regret. "But I can't anymore, not when there are lives at stake." Arthur sat down across from his brother, his heart hammering in his chest. "What are you talking about, Edmund? Where have you been all these years?" Edmund took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Hiding, running away, trying to right our father's wrongs." The mention of his father made Arthur lean forward. "So it's true? Father was involved in the illegal adoptions?" Edmund let out a bitter laugh. "Involved? Arthur, he was the mastermind behind it all, an empire built on the suffering of broken families." The words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. He had always known his father wasn't perfect, but this, it was almost inconceivable. "Why did you run away?" Arthur asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Because I found out the truth," Edmund replied, his eyes filling with tears. "And when I confronted our father, he threatened my life, said I knew too much, that I was a risk." Arthur felt the blood run cold in his veins. The image he had of his father crumbled with each word Edmund said. "But why go back now?" Arthur asked. Edmund leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Because they're moving, Arthur. The scheme we thought had been dismantled is resurfacing. And they know about the boy, Michael." Arthur felt his heart skip a beat. "How?" "I've been monitoring your activities from afar," Edmund explained. "When I heard you'd bought this mansion, I was worried. This place, there are secrets buried. Here, Arthur, dangerous secrets." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. Mari walked in, her eyes widening when she saw Edmund. "Sorry, I heard voices," and she trailed off, looking from one brother to the other. Arthur made the introductions quickly, explaining the situation in a few words. Mari, to her credit, took it all in with surprising calm. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice firm and determined. Edmund looked at her with new admiration. "We fought," he said simply. "But first you must know the whole truth." In the hours that followed, Edmundo unearthed long-buried secrets. He spoke of how his father had started the illegal adoption scheme, using his influence and connections to create a network that stretched across the country. He explained how politicians, judges, and even organized crime figures were involved, all profiting from the suffering of vulnerable families. "And this mansion," Edmund continued, his voice low, "was the center of it all. Here children were brought, documents were forged, money exchanged hands." Arthur felt sick at the thought of how many lives had been destroyed within these walls. Mari, sitting next to him, clutched his hand tightly, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and determination. "But why Michael?" Mari asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why was my son chosen?" Edmund hesitated, giving Arthur an apologetic look before answering. Because Laura was investigating the case." Arthur felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What?" he whispered. "Laura discovered connections, Arthur," Edmund explained gently. "She was close, so close to exposing everything. They silenced her. And then, to make sure you didn't continue the investigation, they orchestrated Michael's kidnapping. It was a message, a warning." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with horror and sadness. Arthur struggled to breathe, the implications of what he had just heard overwhelming him. It was Mari who broke the silence, her firm voice cutting through the tension. "Then let's finish what Laura started. Let's expose them all." Arthur looked at her, awed by her strength. Slowly he nodded, feeling a determination rise within him. "Yes," he said, "for Laura, for Michael, for all the families who have suffered. We will end this." Edmund smiled sadly. "It won't be easy. These people are powerful, dangerous. But we are not invincible," Arthur replied, his voice gaining strength. "We have the truth on our side. And now, we have each other." The three of them spent the rest of the night making plans, reviewing evidence, preparing for the battle to come. When the sun began to rise, tinting the sky with pink hues, they finally allowed themselves a moment of rest. Arthur walked over to the window, looking out over the garden where, in a few hours, Michael and Lucas would be playing, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. He made a silent promise to himself, to Laura and to the children. He would protect this new family he had found no matter the cost. A soft sound made him turn. Michael was standing in the doorway of the office, his sleepy eyes widening at the sight of Edmund. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice mixed with curiosity and caution. Edmund knelt down, getting to Michael's eye level. "I am Edmund, Arthur's brother, and you must be the brave Michael I have heard about." Michael looked from Edmund to Arthur, seeking confirmation. When Arthur nodded with an encouraging smile, the boy visibly relaxed. "Will you help us too?" Michael asked, his voice full of childlike hope. Edmund smiled, a look of determination crossing his face. "Yes, Michael. I'm here to help, we all are." In that moment, watching his brother interact with Michael, Arthur felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Despite all the secrets, lies, and dangers, here was the beginning of something new, something good. A family forged not by blood, but by adversity and the desire to do what was right. Mari joined them, wrapping Michael in a protective hug. The four of them stood there, united, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated through the mansion's windows. It was a new day, bringing with it new challenges but also new hopes. Arthur knew the battle ahead would be difficult. There would be dangers, setbacks, moments of doubt. But looking at the people around him, his redeemed brother, the courageous, Mary, the resilient Michael, he felt for the first time in a long time that they were on the right side of history. And with that certainty burning in his chest, Arthur prepared himself to face whatever the future held. The truth would come out, justice would be served, and this unlikely family would find their path to peace and redemption. The days that followed were a frantic mix of preparations and mounting tension. Arthur, Mary, and Edmundo worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, making contacts, and strategizing. The mansion, once a quiet haven, now hummed with a nervous energy of anticipation. Michael, sensing the change in the air, had become quieter and more observant. His watchful eyes followed the adults as they moved around the house, whispering in corners and exchanging worried glances. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, continued to be a source of joy and light-heartedness, his smiles and occasional laughter reminding everyone of what was really at stake. It was one sunny afternoon when Arthur was in the garden with the children that the first sign that things were about to change arrived. His phone rang, Detective Rodrigo's number flashing on the screen. "Arthur," Rodrigo's voice sounded urgent. "It's time. We have enough to act, but you need to be prepared. This will shake many powerful structures." Arthur felt his heart race. "We're ready," he replied, his voice steady. "What do we need to do?" Rodrigo's instructions were clear. Within 48 hours, a coordinated operation would be launched. Arrests would be made, documents seized, and the truth would finally come out. But until then, they needed to remain vigilant and safe. That night, gathered in the living room, Arthur shared the news with the others. Mary squeezed Michael's hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. Edmund, for his part, looked relieved, as if a huge weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "What now?" Michael asked, his voice small in the silence that followed. Arthur knelt in front of the boy, placing his hands on his shoulders. "Now, Michael, we wait, and we stand together. Remember what I told you about being brave?" Michael nodded, his eyes locked on Arthur's. "That being brave doesn't mean not being afraid, but doing the right thing even when you're afraid." Arthur smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Exactly, and that's what we're all going to do now." The next few hours passed in a blur of subdued activity. Mary and Edmund tightened the mansion's security, while Arthur made final preparations, ensuring that all evidence was safe and ready to be handed over to the authorities. On the eve of the decisive day, a strange calm fell over the house. After putting Michael and Lucas to bed, the adults gathered in Arthur's office, each lost in their own thoughts. "Do you think it will work?" Mary asked, breaking the silence. Edmund was the first to respond. "It has to. We have spent too long in the shadows, allowing evil to thrive. It is time to bring everything into the light." Arthur nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "It won't be easy. There will be resistance, attempts to suppress the truth, but we have to believe that in the end, justice will prevail." The early morning hours brought with them an electric energy. Arthur had barely slept, his mind replaying every possible scenario. When the sound of sirens in the distance reached his ears, he knew it had begun. The phone rang, Rodrigo's voice sounding triumphant on the other end. "It's done, Arthur. The arrests are being made now. We need you at the police station to give statements." What followed was a flurry of activity. Mary woke the children, gently explaining that they would need to leave. Michael, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, holding Lucas close to him. As they drove to the police station, escorted by police cars, Arthur couldn't help but think about Laura, how she had given her life for the truth, and how, finally, her sacrifice would not be in vain. The hours at the police station were intense. Testimonies were given, evidence presented. Arthur watched with a mixture of relief and sadness as once powerful figures were led away in handcuffs, their masks of respectability finally slipping. It was late in the afternoon, when everything seemed to have calmed down, that the last and most surprising turn of events occurred. Daniel, the man who had held Michael captive for so long, asked to speak to Arthur in private. In the interrogation room, face to face with the man who had caused so much suffering, Arthur felt a burning rage threaten to consume him. But then, to his surprise, Daniel began to cry. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed, his previous arrogance completely gone. "I never wanted to. They forced me, they threatened my family." Arthur listened silently as Daniel reeled off a tale of blackmail, threats, and coercion. It wasn't an excuse, far from it, but it shed new light on the complexity of the situation. When he finally left the room, Arthur felt strangely light. He hadn't forgiven Daniel, but understanding the circumstances that led him to those actions brought him a certain peace. Outside the police station, Arthur found his makeshift family, waiting for him. Michael ran into his arms, and Arthur hugged him tightly, feeling tears of relief and gratitude burn in his eyes. Mari approached, Lucas in her arms, and Edmundo completed the circle. There, under the sunset sky, they allowed themselves a moment of pure joy and relief. "Is it over?" Michael asked, his voice muffled against Arthur's chest. Arthur exchanged glances with Mari and Edmundo before answering. "The worst, yes, Michael, but our journey, it's just beginning." In the months that followed, the story emerged, in all its complexity. Newspapers, television, and social media were abuzz with revelations. Families long separated were reunited, the truth finally bringing closure to old wounds. The mansion, once a symbol of dark secrets, has been transformed. Arthur and Mari, with Edmundo's help, have converted it into a support center for families affected by illegal adoptions. The hallways that once echoed with tears of separation now resound with laughter of reunion and healing. Michael and Lucas grew up surrounded by love and security. While the scars of their past never completely disappeared, they became reminders of their resilience, not their suffering. On a quiet afternoon, almost a year after the events that changed their lives, Arthur found himself alone in his office. Looking at a photo of Laura, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "We did it, my love," he whispered. "We finished what you started." A noise at the door made him turn. Michael was standing there, smiling shyly. "Can I come in?" he asked. Arthur opened his arms, and Michael ran to him. As he held the boy who had become so precious to him, Arthur reflected on the twists and turns of life. What had begun as a quest for isolation and oblivion had turned into a journey of redemption, love, and family. Outside, the sound of laughter and conversation floated through the air. Mari, Edmundo, and Lucas were in the garden, preparing a picnic. It was a scene of normality and happiness that not so long ago Arthur had believed was forever out of his reach. "Shall we?" Michael asked, pulling Arthur toward the door. "Mummy said she made that cake you like." Arthur smiled, letting himself be guided by the boy. "Sure, let's go." As they walked into the garden to join their newly formed family, Arthur felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had given him a second chance, a chance to make a difference, to love again. And there in the soft late afternoon sun, surrounded by those he had grown to love, Arthur knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family, as it should be.